Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Joe Facklam. I'm the Program Associate for Restore the Fourth National and am based out of South Minneapolis. There will be a 15-minute questionnaire portion of this panel where the audience can ask questions for the panelists. If you have a question for any of the panelists, feel free to just enter it into the chat box on the stream. Now that the trial of Derek Chauvin has begun, it has become clear that the government has had plenty of time to prepare and has already started to coordinate and prep for any potential protests. Indeed, since the storming of the Capitol in January, we have seen increased interest in mass surveillance programs. In the state of Minnesota, we've already seen politicians expressing interest in giving more money to mass surveillance tools like fusion centers under the guise of combating white supremacist terrorism. But these tools are neither neutral nor effective, and we know that they have disproportionate impact on groups already disproportionately targeted by our racist policing system, and especially protesters that will take to the streets in the coming months in response to the Derek Chauvin trial. As Minnesotans collectively hold their breath waiting for the jury to hand down a verdict, and as protesters prepare to take the streets, and as the government marshals its vast resources in response, it is important that we ask ourselves, what does it mean to protest in an era of mass surveillance? How do we keep ourselves safe? When the government gathers its power in such a visible way, it has an impact on the ability of protesters to make change. We've already seen how the government has effectively physically militarized downtown Minneapolis. It's not a stretch to think that they will be using other, less visible tools to quell protests. Information is its own kind of power. They know where the protesters are, where they plan to go next. They can coordinate their response and limit the effectiveness of the protester, and thus limit their ability to enact change. When we talk about privacy in the Fourth Amendment, it is often a discussion of abstract values, but when you're a protester loudly chanting that the system is unjust and that Black Lives Matter and that fundamental change needs to happen on every level, it directly affects you. With that, I want to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. They'll say their name and their position, and then we'll get into the questions. Isabella, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Isabella Nascimento. I'm a staff attorney with the ACLU of Minnesota. My pronouns are she, her. And I am honored to be here today. I have a few cases from the uprisings here and protests here in Minneapolis from last summer in response to the murder of George Floyd, and here to chat about some of the things we can expect coming in response to the trial of Derek Chauvin. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Freddie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, Freddie Martinez, he, him, his is fine for me. I'm a policy analyst at Open the Government, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to transparency across the federal government. A lot of my work is focused on police surveillance and how it manifests itself in various different ways. And I've been doing this work for about 5 or 6 years now. And, we've done everything from, investigations on police surveillance to sort of working with members of Congress to understand its impact. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Freddie. Mahesha, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'd be happy to. My name is Mahesha Subbaraman. I am a solo appellate attorney who practices here in Minneapolis. I'm born and raised Minnesotan, and I've been practicing law for now about 10 years or so, and the last 5 as a solo practitioner. I also help to head up the litigation working group for Restore the Fourth National, and in that capacity have helped to lead Restore the Fourth's charge in filing amicus briefs or friend of the court briefs with the Supreme Court and other federal and state courts on a variety of Fourth Amendment issues.
And I'm Bruce Schneier. I'm a technologist really by training, moving into policy. I've been working in security and privacy since forever, since the 90s. And I write, I speak, I teach. I do a lot of work in this space. And oddly enough, I do live in Minneapolis, which is a coincidence, but seems to be useful here.
Thank you so much, y'all. Okay, with that, I guess we will jump into one. I will let Freddie answer first, and then I want to give Bruce a chance to answer it as well. What are some examples of surveillance technology, and how are they deployed against protesters?
That's such a long, in-depth question, but you know, I think primarily the ones that people should worry themselves about are technologies like license plate reader technology, which takes photographs of people coming and going from fixed GPS locations, and can be used to build things like historical overviews of where a person. We've seen a lot of concern about the use of facial recognition technology, which I'm happy to talk about a little bit further. We also know that police use very heavy monitoring of social media, police to find out the plans of protesters, and I would say that that's probably like the largest concern that people should be having, is the use of like fake accounts or you know, catfishing to get people to join to allow police into their communication channels, primarily on Facebook, but also on other social media platforms. And you know, this has been happening for, I guess, over 8 years now. It's been building out, but we've sort of seen it supercharged in some ways. So, like for example, in Chicago, after following looting that happened this summer, the city of Chicago deployed a 20-person social media monitoring tool that like is supposed to be looking out for threats to like steal stuff, I guess, around the clock. And they've placed it within the Fusion Center in Chicago, which is their sort of counterterrorism center that's been built. There's a network of about 70 of these centers, where local police will share information with federal and you know, state law enforcement agencies and private corporations. So I would say that, you know, primarily the concerns that people should be having is some combination of social media monitoring, facial recognition, and license plate reader technology. But there are other ways to track a person as they move throughout their city. Things like the swipes that someone takes when they hop on and off the bus and things like that. So I would say that it's probably those three technologies that people should be most concerned about.
So I would actually point to two things, basically cameras and cell phones. So cameras are everywhere, and they're used. So these are fixed cameras. These are cameras on vehicles. These are cameras in the sky. They have higher resolution than you think. Right? They can read license plates from near orbit, and they can be used to track individuals. They can track vehicles. They can read license plates. And they're increasingly automatically scanned, and things are correlated. Facial recognition identifies people. So that's sort of one bucket that you will be identified through cameras. The second bucket is you'll be identified through your cell phone. This is a surprisingly promiscuous device. It is constantly broadcasting a unique ID, and there are lots of technologies to capture that unique ID and to use it to track people. And that's just the phone, right? The GPS also. You could go and look at the work researchers did at the U.S. Capitol riots, where we can track like where people are based on their Parler posts, which are GPS tagged based on their photos. But if you are the police, you have much better technologies. You can employ something called a Stingray, which is basically a fake cell phone tower that will capture the addresses of things in the vicinity. So there's a lot of ways you will be tracked, but those are going to be the two major ones: cameras and your phone.
Isabella and then Mahesha, would y'all like to give us some insight onto the legality of those types of technology being employed by the police? Like, is the use of those actually a violation of civil liberties?
We wish.
I actually think it'd be beneficial for Mahesha to answer first, talking about more of the appellate litigation and overview here, and then I can kind of boots on the ground give an answer.
So I'm happy to answer that question from a big picture perspective. When it comes to the question of what is the legality of technologies, various surveillance technologies that are currently in wide use, and it's important to remember that these technologies are often in the hands not just of the government, but also private contractors as well. It's a mixed bag. Courts are the slowest in our governmental system to respond to developments in technology. And because of that, many of the kind of emerging questions that surround the technologies that Freddie and Bruce have identified, whether it's facial recognition or automated license plate readers, those questions have yet to work their way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They've made it part of the way in some courts. Some state high courts have addressed the question. For example, courts in, for example, Minnesota or Massachusetts have addressed some of these questions piecemeal. But I think the important place to start with your question is when we talk about violations of civil liberties, exactly what rights are we talking about? And there are kind of two main sources of rights that we can be talking about in the legal system once we kind of put aside a general sense of moral outrage about being monitored. One is what's called the positive law. So statutes, regulations, rules, things that people have passed which say you can use this technology, you can't use this technology, you can watch this person, you can't watch this person. If you watch this person, you need to get a warrant, et cetera, et cetera. The second source of legal authority is the Constitution. And in particular, in this area, it's usually some intersection of the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and imposes certain requirements with respect to the obtaining of warrants, or the Fifth Amendment, which in its due process clause may contain some substantive liberty protections against certain types of surveillance. But that's a question that is still subject to heavy litigation. And what we have seen over the last 10 years is that as these technologies have developed, the Supreme Court has kind of taken them on piecemeal, and as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, addressed the question of whether or not, for example, law enforcement needs a warrant in order to search a cell phone from someone that they have arrested. And the court answered that question in the affirmative, generally establishing that because of the volume of information that a cell phone contains, any search of it will, in most circumstances, require a warrant. More recently, the court, about 2-3 years ago, addressed the question of cell site location information as obtained through a cellular provider, and the question of whether the police can obtain that information without, or kind of a more foundational question of whether the obtaining of that information is in fact a search, which is then subject to Fourth Amendment protections. And the Supreme Court said, yes, it is, notwithstanding the fact that that information is being disclosed to a third-party cellular provider. So by step after step, the courts are catching up, but they are going to be the slowest. And while some of these technologies have been recognized by the courts to infringe on general privacy guarantees contained within the Fourth Amendment and within other laws, at the same time, the courts have recognized that the government may have the right or the ability to nevertheless conduct those forms of surveillance, either by obtaining or going through the proper legal procedure, be it obtaining a warrant, or in cases of exigent circumstances where there's an emergency. So that's kind of the big picture overview of where things stand on the civil liberties fronts, and do these technologies violate civil liberties? It's an evolving question.
I would agree with Mahesha, and I think the way that he stated it to begin with, that the courts are the slowest to respond to developments in technology is really an important fact here. So taking, for example, automatic license plate readers, there's been vast success in stopping and putting an end to their use just widely in Virginia, for example. But in other areas around the country, courts are looking at it and trying to make comparisons to other areas of law that we have. So, for example, what's in public view, and taking those attempts and where there's not necessarily a good comparison, and courts just haven't caught up to technology to that extent. And so the way that, when you're looking at it, the way you have to consider it is, to what extent does this seem so obvious that you've put it out to the public such that you can't really consider it a violation of privacy or due process versus something that you have in your hand? So, for example, if I have my cell phone in my hand and I've already unlocked it, if someone can see what I'm doing over my shoulder, then that might be considered to the public view versus somebody who's coming in and saying, you have to give me your thumbprint or put your face up there so that it can unlock, and then I can go through the rest of your photos. It's going to be very fact intensive for the courts to go through this type of analysis. And the last thing I'll say is that, for example, here in Minnesota, again, courts just have not kept up with this type of technology. I mean, we're still litigating whether police need a warrant to even look at hotel register records and who's staying there. So talking about, can you access Stingray data? Now that you have those electric scooters and data that's given off of there, plus it's connected to your cell phone, is really an evolving question. And I think that it's going to take a lot of particular lawsuits and really breaking it down for the court exactly what type of technology is this, how accessible is it to the public, and why this would be an infringement on your right to privacy, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, due process, etc. You're going to have to be very explicit with the courts.
Cool. I guess the next question I will give to Bruce and Freddie. What are some good ways or like steps protesters can take to protect themselves against the use of some of this tech, which I understand that a lot of this tech is very different and like affects different ways of attack. So just a general overview.
So I'll start. I mean, it depends on the tech, right? So there are ways to obscure your face so that the cameras don't recognize you. But that, that in itself is going to be suspicious, and you will be someone who has your face covered. You can leave your cell phone at home. In Hong Kong, that's what everyone does because of the way Chinese use cell phones to track protesters. But this is actually valuable. This is valuable for documenting things. This is valuable for communicating, for coordinating. So it's a trade-off, whether you want to carry it or not. Right, social media. You cannot be on social media. But again, that is a trade-off that you will make between the value you get and what you give up. So everyone needs to make these trade-offs. Everyone needs to sort of think about their level of risk, what they're willing to do, what they need to do, and decide. There's no one answer for everybody. And I will tell you all to get Signal and use Signal to coordinate, right? And don't use instant message. Now that's an easy one. But the other stuff really is trade-offs. And you go around the world, you watch protesters in different countries, different police, different tactics, different rules. They make different decisions. And it's going to be the same downtown. Right? You will assume the police will be there. But I would think I would carry this device rather than leave it home. I think it's more valuable for me to have it in my pocket, even though I will be tracked because of it. But not everyone will make that decision. And you have to make it yourself, but understand the technologies and understand what's happening so you can make it informed.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I will also say if you are using Signal, please enable disappearing messages. But I will also say that, I don't know. I mean, to my fair number of demonstrations in my life, and I also think that there's some value in just making assumptions that your phone will not work, right? So the friends that you go with should have a plan to meet up if any of you all get separated, right? These things are very analog. Have a physical map, right? That will really help, because I think we are so reliant on our technology that that we sometimes tend to get lost without it. I will also say that for sure, I mean, I recommend people just pay in cash if needed, or ride your bike to the demonstration if you have one. And then I guess the other thing that really does protect people way more than any kind of technology is just being there with people you trust, and having solidarity among your friend group. That will protect you far more than any any application or any kind of choices you make. I mean, obviously those matter, but really just go with someone you trust, and that will have your back, and that will carry you way further than any one application. But yeah, generally just being aware that the cameras are always on and always spying, and like keeping an eye out for them is really a very important first step. Just being aware that these technologies track all of us, but like not from getting into the street is important.
Awesome. Isabella, I saw you would like to speak. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, so in true ACLU fashion, I'll just jump in with a quick kind of know your rights with respect to protesting. So kind of as Bruce said, it's really important to kind of make that judgment call whether you want to bring your cell phone with you or not. And as Freddie brought up, to the extent that you can pay in cash, do so. You're really limiting the ability to kind of track your every step and in chronological order. But know that when you're lawfully present in a public space, it's your right to photograph or record anything that's in plain view, including police. The police cannot confiscate or demand to view photographs or video without a warrant, and they cannot, under any circumstance, delete that data. They can order citizens to cease activities, including recording, but that's only to the extent that they are truly interfering with legitimate law enforcement activities and other law enforcement operations. I think that carrying your cell phone with you, kind of like Bruce said, is just such a powerful tool to have at your disposal, and to some extent can be an attempt to curb any sort of police misconduct that you may see. To the extent that that's actually curbing things these days is questionable. But at least you're making a record of it. But it helps to get contact information from other individuals, such as witnesses, to the extent that something happens to you, that you can take photographs and document in real time what's going on. And the last thing is that you never have to consent to a search of yourself or of your belongings. And if you do so, that can affect you later in court. And so just know that you never have to provide consent for that. Just a quick plug for those of you that are intending on going out and protesting, particularly now.
Good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, let's get into some other questions. I kind of want to focus on the legal side of some of this tech. So I guess I'll give this question to Mahesha and Isabella again. If a protester suspects they've been targeted by this kind of technology, like what sort of recourses do they have, if any?
So I'm happy to, I guess, briefly comment on that. And I would say that the first and most important thing is if you believe you have been surveilled or monitored in an unjust manner, the first and most important thing that you can do is to what lawyers call build a record. And the reason why building a record is important, especially within a short period of time after whatever the event that you're concerned about occurred, is because as time passes, as recollections fade, it's harder to then put together that past to the extent that going forward, you decide that this is an issue that you want to either bring to greater public attention, perhaps by way of news coverage, or something that you might ultimately want to bring into a court of law by way of litigation. So with that said, kind of then speaking to the question of what recourse or what rights do you have, there are kind of maybe three things that are on the table whenever you believe that there's unjust surveillance at issue. One route obviously is administrative in nature. You can file a complaint with the police department, or you can pursue local kind of political remedies, complain to your city councilman, complain to your mayor, and hopefully through either a political means or an internal administrative means within the police department address that problem. That's route number one. Route number two is you can attempt to make use of public records laws to investigate further what's going on. Minnesota has a Government Data Practices Act, which is our version of the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and it's a fairly robust tool, assuming you know how to use it, for obtaining information from government entities, and can serve as a way to find out more about whether the suspicions that you might have are in fact or can in some way, shape, or form be substantiated by records that are held by various government officials whose activities are subject to record keeping and record production under the Act. And then the third and final route that you have is to file a lawsuit. And usually those lawsuits get filed under a provision of federal law called Section 1983, which is a general statute affording civil rights, protecting that if any person under color of law violates rights that are protected by the Constitution, you can hold that person accountable. Now, there are certain entities that cannot be held liable for damages or otherwise under that provision. For example, you can't sue the state of Minnesota, but you can sue localities like counties or cities, and you can certainly sue police departments and other types of municipal entities that could be responsible for the improper surveillance that you suspect. But it's important to recognize that those suits, more often than not, they're long shots. They are difficult to litigate. They're difficult to prove. They can be very time consuming and very costly, even if you're doing them yourself pro se, which I do not recommend, but I have a kind of personal interest in that being a lawyer. But nevertheless, that disclaimer aside, it can be costly even on a mental level, because the court system, again, it has a lot of hurdles that you have to navigate and a lot of burdens of proof at the initial stage in terms of pleading a complaint and then going to summary judgment. And if you were able to take your case all the way to trial, there are a lot of things that you have to do to win a successful lawsuit. And there are a lot of things along the way that can stymie that effort. So it's one thing to keep in mind, notwithstanding the fact that we are a very litigious society to a certain extent, and romanticize the courts as a vehicle for vindicating our rights.
I have very little to add to that. In fact, the Administrative Government Data Practices Act request and then the legal challenge were really the three things I had jotted down in anticipation. The one thing I'll say that's Minnesota specific is, to the extent that you're using the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, and that's in Chapter 13 of the Minnesota statutes, I'll say tracking the statute in language when you're submitting that request has really, how I've seen, been most successful. So know that you have there, it is public data, arrest data, request for service data, and response or incident data. And to the extent that an investigation is active, it's not public. The moment it becomes inactive, it is all public. And the reason that that's crucial is that to the extent that someone has not charged you with something, if you think that you've been surveilled and there's not an ongoing investigation of you, then anything that they've compiled with respect to that surveillance, particularly with response or incident data, request for service data, and that's going to come from if there's been a response or incident to something that's happened at a protest, or if there's a request for service that they're surveilling a protest, that should be public the minute it's an inactive investigation. So if you haven't been charged with something, if you have been charged with something, then obviously your suspicions were confirmed. You likely were surveilled. But the point being that you can submit these public data requests in addition to the fact that there are discovery rules with the criminal investigation. So some of that will have to be turned over to you. I do think that you have, kind of as Mahesha indicated, a Section 1983 suit is very difficult. You're going to run into things like qualified immunity that we've all been talking about a lot lately. But one of the things that is interesting, that to the extent that you can get past the pleading stage, discovery can be a really effective tool. And you might end up discovering a lot. So to the extent that there is this impetus to want to be able to bring a lawsuit, while costly, and I don't recommend going pro se, but to the extent that you are pursuing a legal challenge, surviving the pleadings and getting to discovery can actually be really fruitful for those purposes. So.
Thank you so much. My next
and I just want to jump in very quickly. Oh, just about public records requests in general. I will strongly advocate that people sort of learn how those function and get used to filing them. I file hundreds very helpful to to figure out new things about what police are doing. I will say though that as you're doing them, it's very important to be creative about where you're sending your requests. So not just to maybe the local police department, but outside counties that are nearby that maybe have come in and assisted them, or in Chicago, the Department of Transportation was sending salt trucks to block the highway so that people couldn't join the protests. So like thinking about all of the ways that a record might exist and where you could possibly obtain a copy of it, it will really maximize your impact. So I highly recommend both that people start filing them, but also just to be very creative about how you send how you send your request.
And there's lots of resources on the internet on all of this. This is something the internet knows well and can teach you.
Awesome. Thank you all. The next question, which I want to throw to Freddie specifically, but also want to welcome all the panelists to chime in. Is there anything that you think needs to change about how we regulate how this tech is deployed by law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Is it regulated? That's the first question. So
a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. So there are a few major concerns about the regulation. First, there is no sort of general federal Privacy Act type. Oh, there's the one in 1974 that has not been updated since then. But there is no sort of federal framework for regulating surveillance technologies. Then the situation becomes worse on the state levels. There is overlaps and then for the regulation of surveillance technologies like drones, for example, states often have carve-outs for law enforcement themselves, and cities themselves also have their own regulation. Lago and they test these technologies, and then they all talk to each other, right? So we have a system where if a local law enforcement can't figure something out, nothing precludes them from asking the FBI for investigations. And so this situation's gotten much worse since 9/11 because that was one of the whole main recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, is to break down these silos of information, right? So basically, like, any regulation that is put in place has to be really well thought through, because you have to prevent situations like police asking asking them to do it, or while this person might not be in this database that I'm interested in, maybe the next sheriff over has a different database that I can look into. And then there's also things like borrowing of tools. So I know of at least one case where the person is on trial or is charged, but they won't bring him to trial because the federal government did the surveillance, but because a local agency can't force the federal government to come and answer court, this person is just in limbo. So you have to think through all of these policies and all of these ways that law enforcement sort of surveillance proliferates in many different ways. And we see that in things like there was a recent article, and I can't remember where, but it said that even for jurisdictions that have banned facial recognition technology, police are still have access to it. And that really goes to show you that, like, it's because they sort of didn't close these loopholes of asking someone to do it on your behalf with a wink wink nudge nudge. And that is sort of a big consideration that everyone who's involved in local campaigns to provide oversight or control of police surveillance technology aware of. And so there are some good models out there for how that should look. San Francisco had a very good one, but even there we see police still accessing information without through loopholes. So just these all that's a problem. And then also to do anything about it. Often we'll hear that because it's technical, somehow members of Congress or the federal government can't figure it out. But also, like, we water and clean air, and I doubt there's a lot of like microbiologists on congressional staff, but we can figure it out if we were interested, right? But there just seems to be no interest in regulating police surveillance. So those are my brief thoughts on that topic.
Awesome, thank you, Freddie. And then a question for Isabella. Have you found that surveillance or military equipment deters protesters at all?
So the answer to that, I think, is no. And that's largely because the First Amendment is such a fundamental protection, and the right to use one's voice, to express yourself, to hit the streets and really advocate for whatever message you're trying to put forward has been strong enough to overcome some of these concerns. All of that said, I think that there's a really great opportunity to use this tech as a force for good. So kind of as I was advocating before, taking your cell phone with you is definitely a risk. That being said, it can be a deterrence mechanism for law enforcement, particularly if there are groups of people, you're with people that you trust. And I'll use one example from one of our cases that we currently have ongoing against, for example, the Minneapolis Police Department. This past summer, after the murder of George Floyd, in response, we had a number of peaceful protests and a lot of journalists who were coming in to cover the protests. Currently, the ACLU is representing a number of journalists who were attacked with tear gas, rubber bullets, other projectiles. And the great thing about journalists, in fact, is that they are, live streaming this. They are taking photographs. It's all on the news. And so it makes a very clear record. And to the extent that you're filing a complaint, I mean, we have pictures, we've have videos, we have things in real time, photographs of injuries. I mean, not just photographs of injuries in that moment, but I mean, the progression of bruises to show just the extent of these injuries as they're going on. And so I think what I'll say is that I would hate to see it be a deterrent, because the First Amendment is just so fundamental to our country. And I would like to be able to see some of the tech that we have at our disposal as citizens to be able to deter police misconduct, in addition to creating real-time records that can lead to accountability.
Awesome, thank you. And then I think one last question before we get into the audience Q&As portion, which I think I will give to Freddie. Given how common social media spying is there a better platform for organizing than Facebook or Twitter?
That's
Glad you got that, not me.
Yeah, I think that's a very challenging question, because one of the things that gives social networks their value is just how interlinked they are, right? So you're clearly going to reach more people on Facebook, because it's just much larger as a platform than Twitter. The way I think about it is there is no better platform for organizing on social media. I think everyone should just be aware that will turn over your data to law enforcement quite easily, but you should. I mean, I think you should use what works for you. And if you find that Facebook is the voice is the platform you want to use your voice on, then by all means use Facebook. Yeah. So I will say that that's been my interpretation of it. And trying to join group chats and things like that. Just being aware that that's happening is probably a bigger protection than you're maybe like 4 people that follow you on a very niche website that no one is monitoring, right? So that's what I would recommend, but that's, I guess, my personal view.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that is a very balanced answer to that question, because that was a hard question. Cool. On to our audience questions. I guess this first one I want to give to Bruce first, and then give Freddie a chance. Are VPNs useful?
So VPNs are useful. I mean, everything is useful. It depends on what your threat model is. So what a VPN does is it stops someone from eavesdropping on your internet traffic. Doesn't happen a lot in the US. If you were in Turkey, if you were in Hong Kong, I would say yes, use a VPN. Don't consider not using a VPN. In the US, probably a good idea, but that's not going to be how you are going to be surveilled. Or if you are one of the few. Right? That's not the way the United States does it. So yes, I'm a big fan of VPNs. I use them, but I use them mostly when I'm traveling outside the US. Remember when we used to do that? Those are fun times. Because I tunnel into the US. Because if I'm sitting in a coffee shop in Kazakhstan, I do not trust their government. I do not trust their telco. Right? So I use a VPN to tunnel into the United States. In the US, I worry less about it. Your threat model is different, but I don't think this is the threat you're worried about.
Right. And there were some examples of the government doing, like, for example, in the protests 5 years ago, the Disrupt J20 protests around the inauguration, they did try to get a copy of everyone who had ever visited the website. That request was shot down.
Now, a VPN is not going to help you against that. Right? A VPN obscures the path, not the destination. Know what your security does.
Right. And right, but I to Bruce's point, there are that doesn't happen here in often, and because of things like Fourth Amendment protections and First Amendment protections, it's good that we don't have those kinds of same risks. I will say that when you're visiting like sketchy websites or smaller websites that you don't like, I'm not really worried about. I'm more worried about some random person who has their own server finding out where I live than I am worried about like Facebook ratting me.
Facebook knows where you live. They got your GPS on their phone.
Yeah, right. And then just practically speaking, I don't use VPNs I use WireGuard as the backend technology for my VPNs because it's so much better than.
That's probably above the pay grade of a lot of the listeners. VPNs are hard. You have to trust somebody. I use NordVPN. Why do I trust them? I kind of do. Do I know they're trustworthy? No. VPNs can sell you out. You pick a VPN that's owned by the Chinese, and guess what? Chinese knows your stuff.
And just on that note, I think someone in our audience asked, what is a threat model? So I guess I'll give that to Bruce.
So let's talk about this, right? So we are downtown. We are protesting. The police are going to look for basically excuses to arrest us. And if we're arrested, excuses to charge us and excuses to convict us. So our goal is to avoid all of those things. The first offense is not doing anything illegal. Now, it doesn't stop you from getting arrested. It doesn't stop you from getting corralled. It doesn't stop you from getting, shut down. But, you won't be convicted of something. Then your threat model is to be able to move, right? To be able to move safely, to be able to engage in your protest, to be able to, confront authority to the extent that it is allowed and permissible and is right and just. I mean, to me, that's our threat model. I am less concerned about you being singled out. If they've got your name before you get there, something weird's going on. Likely you are an anonymous person in the crowd and you went down this path and they want to block it off. They're going to push you someplace else. You're right in this corral. They're arresting everybody within 20 feet because that's what they're doing. And those feel to me like the threat model we're worried about. If violence breaks out, suddenly it's a lot worse because now you actually have your physical, or you are worried about being harmed by the police. So now you need to be able to move quickly, move freely. This to me is the threat model. That you were in the protest is likely going to be known. Think about if you see how the extreme of this, look at what's happening to the insurrectionists in DC. Right? They were down there with their phones, taking selfies, broadcasting a GPS, right? And they are being arrested one by one based on their data. and it's well after the fact. Now, they were conservative, they were the right, that's what happens to them. We protest, there's a lot more actual violence in the moment against us. And so to really think about what's likely to happen when you think about your threat levels. So those are my thoughts on that. I'd love to hear other people talk about this.
Yeah, if anyone else wants to.
Actually, I want to hear Freddie talk about this.
Yeah,
Let's be honest.
I mean, just broadly, it's an accounting of like what your risks are, what are those things that you cherish that you want to protect, and what happens as a consequence of an inability to protect them. So, for example, you get arrested and your phone is picked up, right? Like there are probably some things that, there's a lot of personal information on phones, but is there incriminating information on your phone, or is it, memes that you don't care if anyone sees, right? And so keeping a stock of like not only of like what are the things that I have, but what would happen to them if they were to fall outside of my control, and then what are the practical ramifications of that. And so for example, maybe you get arrested and speaking, what happens is there's against you, right? Which probably would not have happened if you didn't get arrested. So it's just keeping a mental model for what you're worried about and what could happen as a consequence of losing control of your assets. And that's basically how I think about it.
So I'm going to suggest a resource. The EFF Security Survival Guide is a really good document where you can look at, they talk about different threats and what you should do about them. Not just in protesting, but sort of this whole thing writ large. So it's your EFF Security Survival Guide. You Google it, read it, and it's written for us, written for regular people trying to stay safe, whether you are protesting in the US or Hong Kong or anywhere in between.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Bruce. That is a very good resource. I have one question I want Isabella to answer. Do our rights with law enforcement differ at all between federal and state police? And then what about the military?
Okay, so it's a little bit nuanced in terms of instead of talking about federal versus state police versus military, what I'll talk about is law at the federal level and then laws at the state level. So the first thing to consider is, and I'll say this, your right is only as good as it is enforceable, right? So if something happens to you, whether you have legal protections is only as good as whether a court is willing to enforce that. But assuming that that's true, you have a base set of rights that are protected under the federal constitution and then federal laws. Consider that a floor. There is no state that can say, under our constitution, you have fewer rights than you do under the federal constitution. The federal constitution is your base set of rights, and that's if all of the states went away, you still have that and the rights that are protected in that. States, however, can afford additional levels of protection. And so, for example, the right to privacy here in Minnesota is actually far more robust than it is at the federal level. And so, to the extent that you are bringing some sort of legal challenge, particularly if you've had some sort of infringement on your rights, it shouldn't be just that, oh, hey, there's the federal constitution, I'm going to go to federal court. You can enforce them under the state constitution and state laws as well, and they can afford additional layers of protection. To your point specifically, what laws each are bound to is state specific. So if you're operating within the state of Minnesota, the state patrol versus Minneapolis Police Department versus National Guard all have to respect that base level of rights. But once you're within Minnesota, you're afforded particular protections. And so they have to live up to those protections that you're guaranteed. Otherwise, they're subject to lawsuits. So that's the way that I would look at it. I would look at it as kind of a federal layer of protection and then an additional state layer of protection that can't go below that.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, we have another question. Let's say I leave my phone at home and cover my face. Is there anything else that could be used to track me? I'll give that question to Freddie and then Bruce, and I actually might have thoughts myself on that.
I mean, do you want to jump in, Joe? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I guess my advice for this person is that, yes, definitely there are ways to track you, even if you leave your phone at home and cover your face. There was a case over the summer of the feds tracking someone down via t-shirt they were wearing. It was ordered from Etsy. And I think they had like left a comment on the seller's page, or it was like a custom ordered. So clothing is something to be aware of. Shoes, any tattoos that you might have. I have some myself. Facial piercings, haircuts. And then also there's been some thought that gait tracking, which is like the way you walk, is quite specific to people. So I think there's been some thought that that can be tracked, all via like surveillance cameras.
So gate tracking is a thing. It's not really used right now in bulk, but something to be aware of in the future. And I mean, certainly anything about you, Joe is right, anything about your physicality that is unique will certainly can be used to identify you from frame to frame in different cameras as you move through, and also can be possibly used to backtrack you. And then, if you are stopped, they're going to demand identification, and it's going to be hard to say no. And once they have that, then sort of game over. It doesn't matter.
If you're carrying ID, yeah,
which is if you don't have ID, that's got its own set of problems. I mean, they don't make this easy on purpose.
Yeah, right. I recommend just going low tech. Like I said, ride your bike. Avoid paying with a credit card or debit card if you can. And then I think it's very important. I often
I think we lost him.
Protests. Oh, hello.
Yeah, you dropped out for about 10 seconds, 5 seconds. So backtrack.
Thank you, Bruce. I would say that the biggest risk is for people getting in and out of protests. That's always where it seems to be a very volatile situation. If you want to change, maybe you have to do it outside of the perimeter, or half a mile down or something like that, and leave with friends. Also, this is not specific to a threat model. Just bring water and comfortable shoes. Please.
That is
water.
Totally a threat model.
Yeah, please bring water and like snacks and eat some food that day of.
Right, energy bars.
Awesome, great advice, everyone. And then another question that deals less with government mass surveillance. What are some notable ways that we can protect ourselves from civilians who might be monitoring video and internet traffic and are not bound by laws and legality, i.e. people trying to dox protesters? Is there anyone who would be interested in answering that one?
It's a hard question, right? Because all this tech we talked about matters, and people will be using it without legal constraint. So it's the same defenses, but you don't have the constitutional legal protections. And as we know, the police can often buy information they themselves can't legally collect. Things like doxing, right? This is hard. And if your identity's out there and someone wants to dox you, they're going to do it. Right? This is raw power. And, we don't have defenses except be anonymous, which is kind of a stupid defense. So I don't have a good answer to that, which I'm sorry about.
So maybe I can chime in a little bit on that and say, to the extent that you're looking to, ironically enough, the police or the court system to address those forms of surveillance, there are general tools available. I mean, the mere fact that abusive practices move from a physical form like stalking to an electronic form like doxing doesn't place the person beyond the jurisdiction of the law or beyond some of the common tools that the law has used to address the traditional physical iterations of these forms of harassment. So things like temporary restraining orders or harassment restraining orders are an example of an immediate way in which the law
if
can
you
deal
know
with
the
this.
person who's doing it to you. But if it's like Freddy237 at AOL,
Right.
you're not going to know who that is.
And keep in mind, there's also, in addition to, there have been some interesting lawsuits on this point, kind of arising largely in the context of file sharing services, for example, where you have an intellectual property holder who sues a bunch of IP addresses because they don't have the names of the people who have taken their intellectual property. But beyond that, there are also a variety of common law claims, things like trespass, and to the extent that what a person is doing is interfering with, for example, your business, interference in various types of forms with economic advantage. There are various fancy terms that the law attributes to those types of claims. And then there are also certain privacy-based, what are called torts, but wrongs that the law recognizes, including things like intrusion upon seclusion. But it's always important to recognize, once again, that the courts are kind of the slowest moving mechanism in all of this. And so if you're trying to obtain satisfaction very, very quickly, or hoping to obtain satisfaction very, very quickly, outside of something like a harassment restraining order where you know who the person is who is targeting you, the court system can take its time.
I'm even less optimistic. I mean, a lot of these things happen because we're just not able to prosecute them. I mean, the system doesn't care as much as it should.
I'll chime in on one thing, and there is the option of, or there exists in the law that you can say that someone is acting as a state actor, even if they're a private actor, if they're doing so specifically for purposes of, say, turning something over to law enforcement. So there are mechanisms for that, although it's difficult to prove, but to the extent that you can find out the identity of this individual and either they're working in conjunction with or their sole purpose is to turn over this information to law enforcement, the arm of the law can at times reach them.
Yeah, but the reality is we don't get these wins a lot. License plate scanning companies are running rampant, even though they turn over the police. Ring doorbells. I mean, we can just go on and on and on of companies that cooperate with the police way more than they have to.
And jurisdiction is a real problem, because to the extent what you're being targeted with is outside your state or perhaps even outside the country,
right.
That just increases the difficulties of the legal system exponentially, just as a matter of court power to be able to address those issues.
Okay, I have one last question because it feels important, quick for Freddie, and then I'll get into wrapping things up. Okay, do we have a good idea of what extents of social media monitoring there is? Specifically, do fusion centers and tech like that have access to private Facebook groups?
Did we lose Freddie? Yeah, you're back.
That little question about everything after fusion centers.
Yeah. Specifically, do fusion centers and tech like that have access to private Facebook groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a variety of actors who do social media. There are like I think the FBI has access to way more social media monitoring information, and DHS specifically as federal agencies than like local police and law enforcement. Typically, the way social media monitoring will happen is they'll create what they call geofences, but like I want to know every single Instagram post in this given area, and they'll people's information. The other way that it's done is through like networks. So like let's say that I'm interested in Bruce's social media profiles, and then I want to also know who Bruce is talking to, and then I would try to build out a map basically a network analysis map to figure out, you know, who's who in the network.
So everybody on this call is now linked to me. Sorry.
Right. So it's typically some combination thereof. And usually it's very, I would say it's probably more hyperlocal than people imagine. Facebook has a lot of tools for doing analysis of people's profiles. So it doesn't take much. I mean, one cop sitting there on Facebook 8 hours a day is really all it takes. And we know that there are teams like that that are 24/7 just on social media monitoring. So I would say that if you're particularly concerned, just be aware that it's likely some form of that. And then I would also say, yeah, with group DMs or group conversations, I just would say treat it as if police were already watching, because you really don't know what tech vendors are going to do with your data. So I would say that just pretend or act like as if group chat reporting back to the police, because that's probably in your best interest anyway. It's a great question.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I also want to thank our panelists for being here. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us all. Restore the Fourth Minnesota will be hosting surveillance self-defense workshops this week, where you can get personalized advice about how to stay safe in the world of digital surveillance. Tomorrow, Friday, there will be two, one at 5 p.m. and one at 7 p.m. If you can't make that, there will be another set of workshops next week, Friday, again at 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. And then also, please consider donating to Restore the Fourth. You can donate at www.rt4.mn/donate. We are a primarily volunteer-led organization with a shoestring budget, and every contribution helps us do this work. You can subscribe to our mailing list on our website, www.rt4.mn. Awesome. Thank you all.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks all.